Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
The evening began with the sort of quiet anticipation that St. Mary Mead prized above all else. Lamps glowed softly behind lace curtains, and the last of the daylight slipped away without ceremony, leaving the village wrapped in a calm that felt almost deliberate. It was the night of the winter social at the old parish hall, an unremarkable event by any standard, yet one that drew nearly everyone out of habit rather than enthusiasm. Attendance, after all, was a form of reassurance. It proved one belonged. Miss Marple arrived early, as she always did, her gloved hands folded neatly around her handbag. She took in the arrangement of chairs, the placement of teacups, and the slight unevenness of the trestle tables. None of it mattered, and yet everything did. Order, she knew, was how people disguised their disorder. She smiled faintly to herself as she settled into a seat near the wall, well positioned to observe without seeming to do so. The room filled gradually. Voices rose, then softened, then rose again as neighbours greeted one another with warmth that was both genuine and carefully measured. A woman laughed a little too loudly at a remark that was not especially amusing. A man adjusted his scarf repeatedly, though the hall was quite warm. Miss Marple noticed these things without judgment. Such gestures were small confessions, often unintentional. At the centre of the gathering moved a guest who did not belong to the village, though no one would have put it quite that way. He was introduced politely, spoken of with interest, and regarded with the faint curiosity reserved for outsiders who seemed to know more than they ought. He spoke easily, listened attentively, and gave the impression of being entirely at ease. That, Miss Marple thought, was sometimes the most telling quality of all. Tea was poured, biscuits were passed, conversation drifted from the weather to distant relatives, from the difficulty of travel to the reliability of old friends. Underneath it all ran a current of unspoken tension, subtle but persistent. Miss Marple sensed it the way she sensed a change in the air before rain. People were careful tonight, choosing words with unusual precision, as though silence itself were preferable to error. As the evening wore on, small groups formed and reformed. Miss Marple listened as one woman confided her disapproval of modern habits, while another lamented how quickly people forgot old obligations. Across the room, the guest spoke quietly with a local man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. Miss Marple noticed how often that man glanced toward the door, as though measuring distance rather than time. There came a moment, unnoticed by most, when the hum of conversation dipped slightly, then resumed. A chair stood empty where it had not been before. Miss Marple's eyes moved there almost of their own accord. No one remarked upon it. People rarely noticed absences until they were undeniable. She sipped her tea and said nothing. The evening ended politely. Coats were collected, thanks were exchanged, and promises of future visits were made with vague sincerity. Outside, the night air was sharp, and the moon cast pale light over the lane. Miss Marple walked home at her usual pace, her thoughts unhurried. Somewhere behind her, a door closed with a sound that carried further than it should have. By morning, the absence could no longer be ignored. The guest had not returned to his lodgings. His belongings remained untouched. No note had been left, no message sent. The village responded as villages always did, with concern that quickly transformed into speculation. People recalled details they had overlooked the night before, now reshaping them into something meaningful. Miss Marple listened as these recollections were shared, noting how certainty grew in proportion to repetition. She was visited that afternoon by a neighbour who spoke in a hushed voice, as though walls themselves might overhear. The conversation was filled with questions disguised as statements and statements offered as concern. Miss Marple responded mildly, her comments seemingly harmless, yet each one carefully chosen. She had learned that people revealed far more when they believed they were doing the explaining. By evening, the word disappearance was being spoken openly. Some suggested an accident, others departed. A few hinted at something darker without daring to name it. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting steadily. Her gaze occasionally lifting to the lane outside, she thought of the guests' easy manner, of the chair left empty, of how no one had spoken that night when perhaps they should have. Silence, she reflected, was rarely passive. It was chosen, and like all choices, it carried consequences. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had rearranged itself around the disappearance as neatly as it ever rearranged itself around a new baby or a funeral. Curtains twitched earlier than usual, and people found reasons to linger at gates or pause by the postbox. It was not curiosity alone that drew them out, but a shared unease that demanded confirmation through the company. To be alone with one's thoughts on such a morning felt imprudent. Miss Marple observed this quiet choreography from her front sitting room, where the kettle boiled with comforting regularity. She poured her tea carefully, noting how the steam curled and vanished. Things, she reflected, rarely disappeared without effort. Even a thought required encouragement to fade completely. She had scarcely taken her first sip when there came a knock, light but insistent. The visitor was Mrs. Holland, who lived 2 doors down and prided herself on knowing everything before anyone else did. She spoke at once, as though the words might escape if not hurried out. The guest, she said, had been seen late last night, or perhaps it was early morning. No one was quite certain. Someone's dog had barked. Another person had heard footsteps. Mrs. Holland herself had slept badly and therefore trusted her impressions more than usual. Miss Marple listened with polite interest, asking only the smallest of questions. She allowed Mrs. Holland to circle her own story, adjusting it slightly each time, smoothing inconsistencies as one might smooth a crease from fabric. When the account finally ran out of momentum, Miss Marple remarked mildly that people often mistook sounds in the night, particularly when they expected to hear something. Mrs. Holland agreed readily, though she looked faintly disappointed. Later, as Miss Marple made her way to the village shop, she encountered further fragments of the same tale, each one altered just enough to reflect the teller. The shopkeeper suggested that the guest had seemed restless. A young mother insisted he had looked perfectly content. An elderly man was certain he had once known someone who vanished in much the same way and was never heard from again. None of these statements were offered with malice. They were simply attempts to give shape to uncertainty. At the shop counter, Miss Marple noticed how the conversation paused when she approached, then resumed with exaggerated casualness. She selected her items slowly, giving the others time to grow comfortable again. People spoke more freely, she had found, when they believed the moment had passed. It was then that a remark was made about the guest's interest in village history, how he had asked questions that suggested a deeper purpose than idle curiosity. The speaker laughed it off, but the laugh was thin. When Miss Marple returned home, she found a note waiting for her, delivered by hand rather than post. It was from the local police officer, requesting a brief conversation should she be at leisure. The phrasing was courteous, almost apologetic. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Authority, she knew, disliked unanswered questions even more than gossip did. The officer arrived that afternoon, removing his hat with care and declining tea with visible reluctance. He spoke plainly, asking whether Miss Marple had noticed anything unusual at the gathering. She replied that gatherings were always unusual if one paid close attention, then offered a few innocuous observations. She mentioned nothing of the empty chair, nor of the man who watched the door. Instead, she spoke of general impressions, of moods and manners. The officer listened, nodding, though it was clear he had hoped for something more concrete. As he left, he remarked that disappearances were not always crimes. Miss Marple agreed at once, adding that they were, however, always choices. The officer paused, as though considering this, then went on his way. The remainder of the day unfolded with an almost oppressive normality. Children played, laundry was hung, letters were written. and yet beneath it all lay the knowledge that something had shifted. Miss Marple sat by her window once more, her knitting steady, her thoughts precise. She considered the guests' questions about the village, how specific they had been, and how carefully phrased. She recalled the way certain villagers had answered too quickly, while others had hesitated. In the early evening, footsteps approached her gate. This time it was a young woman from the far end of the lane, one who rarely visited and seemed uncomfortable doing so now. She spoke nervously, glancing about as though expecting interruption. She said she had remembered something, though she could not explain why it mattered. The guest, she said, had asked her about an old path behind the cottages, one that was no longer used. Miss Marple thanked her warmly, as though she had been told something of no great consequence. After the young woman left, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and gazed thoughtfully at the garden. Old paths, she knew, were seldom forgotten entirely. They lingered in memory, even when overgrown. People were much the same. Whatever had happened the night before, it was already rooted in the village's past, and the past, Miss Marple reflected, had a habit of resurfacing when least expected. As darkness fell once more, St. Mary Mead grew quiet again, though it was a different quiet now, heavy with awareness. Miss Marple closed her curtains and reached for her knitting, her mind already arranging the fragments she had collected. The village believed it was merely waiting for answers. Miss Marple knew better. It was waiting to be understood. The next morning brought snow, light at first and then steadily falling, softening the village into a quieter version of itself. Footsteps vanished almost as soon as they were made, and familiar landmarks blurred into pale outlines. It was the sort of morning that encouraged people to look inward, yet St. Mary Mead resisted solitude. Doors opened, voices carried, and the disappearance returned at once to every conversation, as persistent as the cold. Miss Marple stepped carefully along the lane, her boots leaving neat impressions that she noticed with interest. Fresh snow, she thought, was very revealing. It showed not only where one had been, but how one had walked there. At the corner near the old cottages she paused, observing a set of footprints that had already begun to fade. They led part way toward the disused path, and then stopped abruptly, as though the walker had hesitated, turned, or been interrupted. She did not linger. Lingering invited notice, and notice encouraged people to alter their behavior. Instead, she continued on to the cottage where the guest had been staying, now guarded by an air of restrained intrusion. The door stood open, though nothing inside appeared disturbed. A neighbour hovered nearby, eager to explain that the police had already looked through everything and found nothing amiss. Miss Marple nodded politely and remarked how easy it was to misplace things in unfamiliar surroundings. Inside, the rooms were tidy to the point of impersonality. The guest, it seemed, had taken care not to leave much of himself behind. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly, taking in the arrangement of objects, the absence of clutter, the deliberate neatness. People who lived lightly, she knew, often had reasons for doing so. She noted a book left open, its spine carefully preserved, and a coat folded with almost excessive precision. The neighbour chatted on, offering theories that grew increasingly elaborate. Miss Marple murmured agreement at appropriate intervals, though her attention was drawn instead to the window. Outside, the snow lay undisturbed, save for a narrow patch where it had been brushed away. Someone, she thought, had stood there recently, looking out rather than in. By midday, the village seemed to have reached a collective decision that speculation was no longer sufficient. Small groups formed and dissolved, each one convinced it held a crucial insight. Miss Marple found herself invited to several such gatherings, her reputation for listening making her a welcome audience. She accepted graciously, contributing little beyond sympathetic noises and the occasional mild observation. At one such meeting, held in a warm kitchen with the smell of baking bread, a man spoke sharply of the guests' questions. He insisted they had been intrusive, even prying. Another person countered that curiosity was hardly a crime. The argument grew heated, revealing more about the speakers than about the absent man. Miss Marple watched closely, noting how one woman avoided eye contact whenever the past was mentioned, and how another smiled too readily when reassured. Later, as she walked home, Miss Marple encountered the young police officer again, his uniform dusted with snow. He asked if she had seen anything new. She replied that she had seen many old things, newly arranged. He looked puzzled, but thanked her nonetheless. Authority, she reflected, often preferred facts to patterns, even when patterns were more instructive. The afternoon light faded early, turning the snow a faint blue. Miss Marple sat once more at her window, knitting in her lap, her eyes occasionally straying to the lane. A figure passed, paused, then continued on more quickly. There was nothing remarkable about it, and yet something about the haste seemed unnecessary. People hurried, Miss Marple knew, not always because they were late, but because they wished to be elsewhere. As evening approached, a knock came at her door. This time it was the man who had spoken sharply earlier, his expression strained. He apologized for disturbing her, but said he felt uneasy and could not explain why. He asked whether she believed the guest would return. Miss Marple considered this before answering that people usually returned only if they had unfinished business. The man's relief was immediate, followed by something like disappointment. When he left, Miss Marple reflected on how often people sought reassurance when what they truly wanted was absolution. She returned to her knitting, her mind moving steadily through the day's impressions, the footprints that ended too soon, the brushed snow by the window, the careful neatness of the guests' belongings. None of it proved anything, and yet together they suggested intention rather than accident. That night, the snow fell again, heavier now, erasing what little evidence remained. St. Mary Mead slept uneasily, wrapped in white silence. Miss Marple lay awake for a time, listening to the muffled sounds of the village. She thought of the old path behind the cottages, how it had once been well used, how secrets often followed such routes when newer roads felt too exposed. Before sleep claimed her, she reached a quiet conclusion. Whatever had happened, it had been shaped as much by the village as by the vanished guest. St. Mary Mead liked to believe itself transparent, but, like all small places, it had learned long ago how to hide in plain sight. And Miss Marple, her thoughts settling at last, knew that understanding would come not from what was missing, but from what remained carefully, deliberately untouched. By the third day, the disappearance had settled into the village like an unwelcome guest of its own. People woke with it on their minds and went to bed still turning it over, reshaping it to suit their fears or comforts. The police presence, discreet but unmistakable, lent the affair a seriousness that discouraged outright invention, yet gossip thrived nonetheless. Miss Marple observed how each retelling adjusted itself subtly to the teller's temperament, becoming either more sinister or more reassuring according to need. She attended the small gathering arranged that afternoon at the vicarage, where the official questions were asked with careful politeness. The vicar's wife poured tea with slightly trembling hands, though she smiled bravely. Miss Marple accepted her cup and listened as the officer invited recollections of the evening once more. Details emerged with renewed confidence. Someone remembered a raised voice, another recalled a shadow near the side door, a third insisted there had been nothing at all unusual. Miss Marple noted the contradictions without comment. What interested her more were the pauses. One woman hesitated before answering a question about the guest's movements, then supplied a statement that sounded rehearsed. A man interrupted unnecessarily, as though anxious to redirect attention. Miss Marple watched his fingers tap against his knee, quickening whenever the conversation strayed toward the old path behind the cottages. Such signs were easy to miss if one listened only to words. After the gathering, Miss Marple walked slowly back through the village, choosing a route that took her past the disused path. Snow still lay there, thinner now, disturbed in places by footprints that crossed and recrossed without pattern. She paused just long enough to note how the ground dipped slightly near the hedge, a shallow hollow that might easily escape notice. It was the sort of place where something could be concealed briefly, if one knew it was there. She was joined unexpectedly by the local shopkeeper, who spoke of the inconvenience the affair was causing. Deliveries were delayed, customers distracted. His complaint, offered lightly, carried an undercurrent of irritation. Miss Marple sympathized, remarking that disturbances often revealed more than they disrupted. The shopkeeper laughed uncertainly and changed the subject, but his glance toward the hedge lingered a moment too long. That evening brought a development that electrified the village. A personal item belonging to the guest was found near the edge of the old path, half buried in snow and leaves. The discovery drew a small crowd, restrained by the officer's firm instructions. Miss Marple stood at a distance, her eyes sharp. The item had been placed rather than dropped, she thought, angled deliberately, as though meant to be seen eventually rather than immediately. The reaction was swift and uneven. Some villagers appeared relieved, others alarmed. A few looked almost triumphant, as though a troublesome uncertainty had at last been given shape. Miss Marple observed how one woman covered her mouth in shock, yet failed to look at the object itself, while another bent forward eagerly, her curiosity barely contained. Guilt and innocence, Miss Marple reflected, were rarely tidy emotions. Later, at home, Miss Marple received an unexpected visit from the vicar, who confessed his unease. He spoke of the strain the affair placed upon the village's harmony, of old resentments stirred and long-forgotten grievances resurfacing. Miss Marple listened kindly, and suggested that harmony was often more fragile than people liked to admit. The vicar agreed, though his expression suggested he wished the truth were otherwise. When he left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts moving with the rhythm of the needles. She considered the placement of the found object, the renewed confidence of certain voices, the sudden willingness to point fingers. It all suggested direction, not discovery. Someone, she felt, was guiding the narrative now, shaping it carefully. The following morning, the police announced that attention would focus on a particular individual whose behavior had raised questions. The name was received with a murmur that was part surprise, part satisfaction. Miss Marple felt a familiar stir of doubt. Obvious answers, she knew, were often comforting precisely because they spared one the effort of deeper examination. She encountered the named suspect later that day, by chance, or so it appeared. The person greeted her politely, too politely perhaps, and spoke at length about the injustice of suspicion. Miss Marple responded with gentle sympathy, remarking how easily misunderstandings arose in close communities. As they parted, she noted the faint tremor in the person's hand and the quick glance toward the cottages, where the old path lay hidden behind hedges and snow. That evening, as dusk settled once more over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. The village had begun to choose its answer, eager to close the door on discomfort. Yet the true shape of events, she believed, lay still beneath the surface, waiting patiently. And patience, Miss Marple knew well, was often the most dangerous quality of all. The following morning brought a brittle clarity to the village, as though the night had scrubbed the lanes clean of rumour and left only footprints of unease behind. Miss Marple rose early, her mind already occupied by the oddities she had been turning over like pebbles in her pocket. There had been the quarrel by the hedge, overheard but never quite seen, and the letter discovered where it did not belong, written with a hand that disguised itself too carefully. Over breakfast she arranged her thoughts with the same quiet precision she used to arrange her knitting needles, noting how one small irregularity could unravel an entire pattern. If ignored, she resolved to walk, believing that fresh air had a way of encouraging memories to speak. Her path took her past the vicarage, where the curtains were drawn despite the hour. It struck her as peculiar, for the vicar was usually the first to greet the day. She paused, not from idle curiosity but from the sense that silence can sometimes shout louder than words. At the corner she encountered a neighbour whose face bore the tight politeness of someone guarding a secret. They exchanged pleasantries, yet Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor in the woman's voice when the subject of the previous evening arose. Nothing was said outright, but much was suggested by what went unsaid, and Miss Marple stored it away. By midday the village had begun to hum with a restrained urgency. People moved about their errands with an exaggerated normality, as if daring the day to accuse them. Miss Marple visited the shop under the sensible pretense of purchasing thread. There, between the weighing of sugar and the counting of coins, she observed how the shopkeeper's gaze flicked repeatedly toward the door, as though expecting an unwelcome visitor. A remark about the weather was answered too quickly, a question about deliveries with unnecessary detail. Miss Marple thanked her, left with her parcel, and reflected that anxiety often dressed itself in the costume of helpfulness. Later, she took tea with an acquaintance who prided herself on knowing everything worth knowing. The conversation drifted, as such conversations do, from trivial complaints to more substantial matters. A name was mentioned and swiftly dismissed, but Miss Marple caught the dismissal itself, sharp and defensive. She had learned long ago that innocence did not need to protest quite so energetically. As cups were refilled, a small inconsistency emerged about the timing of an evening call, a matter dismissed as confusion, but lingering in Miss Marple's mind like a faintly discordant note. The afternoon brought a visit from the inspector, whose courteous manner barely concealed his frustration. He spoke of evidence that refused to align itself neatly, of witnesses who remembered selectively. Miss Marple listened with the attentiveness of someone who understood that facts, like people, sometimes needed patience rather than pressure. When she ventured a gentle observation, he smiled indulgently, yet did not dismiss it entirely. She had noticed the smile falter when she mentioned a seemingly irrelevant detail, and that was satisfaction enough for the moment. As dusk approached, Miss Marple returned home and settled by the window, her knitting in hand but her eyes following the last of the daylight. She thought of a case long ago, involving a respectable household and a deception maintained through sheer audacity. The similarity was not exact, yet the principle held. Someone here was relying on the assumption that no one would look too closely at what appeared ordinary. She recalled the misplaced letter again, its tone oddly formal for the intimacy it implied, and wondered who had benefited most from its discovery. That evening a knock at the door brought unexpected company. A visitor arrived with an air of agitation, seeking advice under the guise of concern. Words spilled out too readily, as though rehearsed, and Miss Marple listened, offering little beyond sympathetic murmurs. When the visitor departed seemingly relieved, Miss Marple remained thoughtful. She had noticed a contradiction between what was said and what had been done earlier that day, a contradiction small enough to be overlooked but significant enough to matter. Night settled, and with it came a sense of gathering momentum. Miss Marple reviewed the day's encounters, arranging them into a sequence that felt increasingly coherent: the nervous neighbor, the over-helpful shopkeeper, the defensive dismissal over tea, the visitor's anxious confidence. Each was a stitch, and together they suggested a pattern not of chaos but of design. Someone had been moving pieces into place, trusting that familiarity would serve as camouflage. Before retiring, Miss Marple wrote a brief note, not naming names but outlining a possibility she felt certain would soon demand attention. She folded it carefully, satisfied that the time for speculation was nearing its end. As she extinguished the lamp, she felt the quiet certainty that had guided her through so many puzzles before. The truth was close now, not concealed by darkness but illuminated by the ordinary habits people believed too dull to betray them. In the stillness she smiled faintly, already anticipating the moment when the pattern would be revealed in full. The day unfolded with a peculiar heaviness, as though the village itself sensed that its secrets were growing tired of confinement. Miss Marple spent the morning in quiet observation, seated near the window where she could see the lane without appearing to watch it. People passed more often than usual, some slowing as they went by her gate, others quickening their step. It reminded her of children playing a game they no longer enjoyed but felt compelled to continue. She noted who avoided looking toward certain houses and who looked too often, for both habits could be equally revealing. Shortly before noon she received a message delivered by hand, written in a careful script that aimed for neutrality but failed to disguise urgency. The sender requested a brief meeting, emphasizing discretion. Miss Marple considered the note for some time before agreeing. When the visitor arrived, they spoke of concern for the village's reputation, of the harm that gossip could do if left unchecked. Yet beneath the polished phrases lay fear, sharp and unmistakable. Miss Marple listened patiently, allowing the visitor to exhaust their prepared arguments. It was only when she asked a mild question about a detail the visitor could not possibly have known that the mask slipped, just for an instant. That instant told her more than the entire conversation. After the visitor departed, Miss Marple reflected on how often people underestimated the danger of knowing too much too soon. Knowledge, when acquired prematurely, could betray itself through anxiety. She took a walk to clear her thoughts, passing the green where children played under the distracted supervision of adults deep in whispered conversation. Snatches of those whispers drifted to her, incomplete yet suggestive. Names surfaced, were corrected, then abandoned altogether. The fear of accusation was palpable, and Miss Marple recognized it as the fertile ground in which false assumptions flourished. Her walk took her to the outskirts of the village, where a narrow path led past a seldom-used shed. She paused there, struck by how carefully ordinary it appeared, too carefully perhaps. The ground showed signs of recent disturbance, subtle but unmistakable to someone accustomed to noticing what others missed. Miss Marple did not investigate further, content to file the observation away. She had learned that discovery was sometimes less useful than anticipation. In the afternoon, she paid a call that seemed purely social. Tea was served, pleasantries exchanged, and complaints aired about the inconvenience the recent events had caused. Her host spoke at length, too much at length, offering explanations no one had asked for. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, yet her attention fixed on the rhythm of the speech. There were pauses where there should have been none, and none where a pause might have been expected. When a contradiction arose, it was smoothed over with humour, but humour, Miss Marple knew, was often deployed as a shield rather than a release. As she left, she noticed something small but significant, something her host clearly believed invisible. It was not an object so much as an absence, a missing piece where one should naturally have been. Miss Marple smiled faintly, for absences had a way of speaking volumes to those inclined to listen. She walked home slowly, replaying the conversation and aligning it with what she had already learned. The pattern was growing clearer, though she resisted the temptation to force it into completion prematurely. Later that day, the inspector returned, bearing news that was meant to reassure but instead deepened Miss Marple's suspicions. He spoke of leads that led nowhere, of timelines that stubbornly refused to converge. Miss Marple listened, then gently redirected the conversation toward human behavior rather than physical evidence. She mentioned how people reacted when surprised, how they often clung to the first plausible explanation and defended it fiercely. The inspector frowned, thoughtfully, and admitted that one witness had done exactly that. Miss Marple did not press the point, content to let the idea settle. Evening brought with it an unexpected calm, as though the village had collectively decided to pause. Miss Marple spent the time sorting through old letters, not because they were relevant, but because the act itself was soothing. Among them, she found one that reminded her of a similar case from years before, where a misunderstanding had been carefully cultivated until it hardened into accepted truth. The culprit then had relied not on cunning alone, but on the predictable tendencies of others. The parallel was instructive. As night fell, a sound outside drew her attention. She glanced out to see a figure hesitating near the gate, then retreating into shadow. Miss Marple felt no fear, only a quiet certainty that her presence was being accounted for in someone else's calculations. She extinguished the lamp and sat for a while in darkness, thinking. Whoever was responsible had not acted impulsively. This was not the work of passion, but of planning, and planning required patience. It also required an audience willing to believe in appearances. Before retiring, Miss Marple made a few notes, careful not to draw conclusions but to record impressions while they were still fresh. She underlined one name, not as an accusation but as a reminder. Sleep came slowly, yet when it did, it was untroubled. She felt the familiar confidence that arose when disparate threads began to align. The truth, she knew, was not hiding far away. It was embedded in the village's daily rhythms, waiting for the moment when someone would finally see the pattern for what it was. The following morning brought with it a brittle brightness that felt somehow artificial, as though the village were attempting cheerfulness without conviction. Miss Marple noticed how doors opened a little less widely and how greetings were exchanged with a careful neutrality. People were watching one another, not openly, but with the guarded curiosity of those who feared that any misstep might be remembered later. She took her breakfast slowly, allowing the hum of distant activity to reach her without seeking it out. By mid-morning news arrived of a development that unsettled everyone while satisfying no one. A statement had been revised, not withdrawn but altered just enough to cast doubt on its original certainty. Miss Marple reflected on how often truth retreated by inches before vanishing altogether. She paid particular attention to who seemed relieved by the change and who appeared merely confused. Relief, she knew, was rarely an innocent emotion in such circumstances. She decided to visit a house she had deliberately avoided until now. The timing mattered. Too early and people were defensive, too late and they grew rehearsed. Her host greeted her with strained warmth, ushering her inside with unnecessary haste. The sitting room was immaculate, arranged with an almost aggressive orderliness. Miss Marple remarked on the neatness, eliciting a laugh that lingered a fraction too long. As they spoke, she noticed how certain subjects were approached obliquely, as if direct reference might summon something unwelcome. During the conversation, Miss Marple made a casual observation about the weather on the night in question, deliberately misstating a minor detail. The correction came swiftly, almost eagerly, too eagerly. She apologized gently, praising her host's excellent memory. Compliments, she knew, often encouraged people to reveal more than they intended. Indeed, the conversation soon drifted toward recollections. Some offered freely, others with visible effort. Miss Marple listened for what was emphasized and what was passed over in silence. When she rose to leave, her host accompanied her to the door, continuing to speak even as Miss Marple stepped onto the path. The words followed her like an afterthought, explanations trailing explanations. Miss Marple nodded kindly, but her mind was already elsewhere. She had seen what she needed to see. Anxiety, when sustained too long, produced patterns as distinctive as fingerprints. Her next encounter was entirely unplanned, which made it all the more useful. A villager approached her near the shops, lowering their voice to share a rumor that had grown increasingly elaborate with each retelling. Miss Marple listened without interruption, offering only the occasional murmur of interest. When the speaker finished, they looked expectantly at her, as though awaiting confirmation. Miss Marple merely said that people often mistook coincidence for intention when frightened. The villager frowned, uncertain, and walked away. Miss Marple noted the speed of their retreat. In the afternoon she sat in the garden with her knitting, appearing absorbed in her stitches while observing the comings and goings beyond the hedge. A delivery was made to one house, refused at another, and accepted with visible hesitation at a third. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she considered the significance. Small acts, she knew, often carried the greatest weight, particularly when performed under observation. Later she received a visit she had half expected. The caller attempted a tone of concern, framing their questions as friendly curiosity. Miss Marple answered them with gentle irrelevance, offering anecdotes that seemed to wander far from the point. She watched the caller grow impatient, then suspicious, as the desired information failed to emerge. At one point, Miss Marple mentioned a name she had not intended to mention yet. The reaction was instantaneous, a tightening of the jaw quickly disguised by a smile. It was enough. After the caller left, Miss Marple sat quietly for a long time. The shape of the truth was now unmistakable, though its edges still required refinement. She thought of the earlier disturbance near the shed, of the revised statement, of the eagerness with which certain corrections had been offered. Each detail aligned not through logic alone, but through temperament. The person she sought had underestimated the power of habit, assuming that careful planning could override instinct. It rarely did. As dusk approached, a new piece of information reached her, carried by a voice that trembled despite its attempt at composure. Something had been found, not decisive in itself, but troubling enough to reopen questions many hoped were settled. Miss Marple thanked the messenger kindly and assured them that truth had a way of asserting itself eventually. After they left, she allowed herself a small sigh. The moment was drawing nearer. That evening, Miss Marple reviewed her notes, not to add but to subtract. She crossed out 2 names she had once considered, not because they were innocent of all wrongdoing, but because their sins lay elsewhere. She circled another, then set the pencil down. Tomorrow, she thought, would require delicacy. The truth, once spoken, could not be reclaimed, and its impact depended entirely on how and when it was revealed. Before bed, she stepped outside and looked up at the quiet sky. The village lay hushed beneath it, every house holding its breath. Miss Marple felt neither triumph nor excitement, only a familiar sadness. Human nature, she reflected, was endlessly consistent in its failings. People lied not because they were clever, but because they believed themselves cornered. Tomorrow she would show one of them that the corner had been an illusion all along. Miss Marple rose early the next morning, the air crisp and faintly tinged with frost. The village seemed almost untouched by the events of the previous day, yet there was a tension beneath the calm, like a delicate thread stretched too tightly. She wrapped her shawl about her shoulders and stepped out, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of hedgerows and snow-dusted paths. People were beginning their routines, but there was a wariness in their movements, a subtle hesitation that betrayed lingering unease. Even in the simplest gestures, the residue of fear could be detected, and Miss Marple's keen eye did not miss it. She walked toward the village green, where a few early risers were tending to tasks or exchanging brief nods. Each person's posture, the set of their shoulders, the tilt of their heads, provided her with insights that she stored carefully. She noted who avoided whom, who lingered longer than necessary, and who seemed distracted, as if carrying thoughts they dared not speak. Miss Marple paused by the fountain, watching a man toss a pebble with an absent-minded flick of his wrist. His hands, she observed, trembled ever so slightly, a subtle sign, though not of guilt, of internal unrest. By mid-morning the post had arrived with letters and parcels, some mundane and others carrying the faintest hint of disruption. Miss Marple examined the envelopes casually, noting addresses and handwriting. Certain familiar scripts suggested unease, letters written with a meticulous care that spoke of nervousness. She filed the details away, understanding that in time the smallest discrepancies often revealed more than bold statements. A visitor arrived shortly after, offering news that had already begun to ripple through the village. A discovery had been made in the far barn, a detail overlooked during the initial frenzy, yet the implications were immediately unsettling. Miss Marple greeted the visitor with warmth, though her mind was alert to every nuance. The report was fragmented, each statement punctuated with uncertainty, but the inconsistencies themselves were telling. She asked quiet questions, each phrased with apparent casualness, allowing the speaker to reveal more than intended. When they departed, she remained seated, knitting needles in hand, reflecting on the significance of what had been revealed. Nothing was coincidental. Every hesitation and misstatement was a piece of a larger puzzle she was slowly assembling. The morning moved on, and villagers began to gather in small groups, speaking in lowered tones. Miss Marple observed them from her vantage, noticing who approached whom, and who seemed determined to avoid contact. Rumors spread quickly, some absurd, others plausible, but all tinged with speculation. She smiled softly to herself, aware that fear and curiosity often combined to distort the simplest facts. The behavior of the villagers, she realized, was as revealing as any physical clue. Patterns of avoidance, insistence on certain narratives, and sudden bursts of defensiveness all indicated who felt threatened and why. Around midday, she visited the house of a neighbor who had remained particularly tight-lipped the previous day. The household was immaculate, with every item in its place, yet there was a stiffness in the air, an unspoken tension between family members. Conversation was light, focusing on mundane matters, but Miss Marple's questions, innocuous on the surface, gently probed beneath. She mentioned the weather and small village events, all while observing reactions closely. Each subtle pause, glance, or overemphasized detail was carefully catalogued. By the time she left, she had noted patterns that others would not recognize, patterns that would later illuminate the motives and fears underpinning the events she sought to unravel. Returning home for a brief respite, Miss Marple allowed herself a cup of tea, the warmth grounding her thoughts. She reviewed her observations quietly, mentally aligning each person's behaviors with what she had heard and seen. It became evident that some villagers were playing parts they hoped would conceal truths, while others had unwittingly revealed more than they intended. Miss Marple's mind, always alert to the subtlety of human nature, began connecting these threads into a more coherent picture. Each interaction, no matter how seemingly trivial, was part of a narrative she could almost now perceive. By late afternoon, a messenger brought news that unsettled even the calmest of hearts. An item had been found near the outskirts of the village, a clue unnoticed previously, yet potent in its implications. Miss Marple handled the information with care, understanding that it would provoke reactions and perhaps reveal hidden anxieties. She immediately considered who might be affected, how they might respond, and what misdirections could emerge. Her strategy became clear: to observe, to listen, and to allow the truth to reveal itself through behavior rather than confession. As evening fell, the village was hushed, the cold wind carrying whispers through narrow lanes. Miss Marple settled by her fire, knitting forgotten for the moment, reflecting on the day's subtle revelations. The behaviors she had catalogued, the reactions to news, the small hesitations and inconsistencies, all formed a mosaic that spoke louder than any spoken accusation. Tomorrow would be a day for testing and for careful engagement, and she prepared herself for the interactions that would finally expose the delicate truths buried beneath the polite facades. The night closed over St. Mary Mead, serene yet tense, and Miss Marple, ever patient and composed, knew that she was one step closer to unraveling the complex human tapestry of secrets, fears, and hidden motives that had brought the village to this unsettling pause. The morning air in St. Mary Mead was crisp, carrying the faint scent of smoke from chimneys and the subtle fragrance of frost-bitten holly. Miss Marple rose early, her movements measured and deliberate, aware that the day ahead would require her keenest attention. She had spent the previous evening reflecting on the conversations she had observed, the fleeting expressions that had hinted at unspoken truths, and the minute details that others had dismissed as irrelevant. Each villager's behavior had been a thread, and she was slowly weaving them into a tapestry that might reveal the heart of the mystery. As she walked along the familiar lanes, she noted how the village reacted to the previous day's revelations. Some faces were composed, yet their eyes betrayed unease. Others moved with exaggerated casualness, as if to convince themselves they were unaffected. Miss Marple understood that fear and guilt often made people overcompensate, and she catalogued these subtle cues with practiced precision. Even the children, usually carefree and oblivious, seemed to sense the tension, their laughter hesitant and stifled, echoing through the snow-dusted streets. By mid-morning, Miss Marple made her way to the village square, where a small crowd had gathered, their conversations low but fervent. Gossip spread quickly, each fragment distorted and embellished, yet within these murmurs lay kernels of truth. She listened attentively, piecing together conflicting accounts and noting contradictions. One man insisted he had seen the guest leave the inn just before midnight, while another claimed a shadowy figure had lingered near the bakery. Such discrepancies, she mused, were rarely mere mistakes. They often indicated concealment, a deliberate attempt to mislead or protect. A commotion near the post office drew her attention. Letters had been delivered that carried implications far beyond their content. Miss Marple observed the reactions of the recipients. A slight flinch, a quick glance exchanged between acquaintances, a tightening of the lips. Each subtle movement was significant. She walked among the villagers, posing seemingly trivial questions while quietly scrutinizing their responses. A young woman laughed nervously at an unremarkable comment, betraying her inner turmoil. An elderly gentleman adjusted his spectacles repeatedly, a gesture that suggested he was hiding unease behind a veneer of civility. Later, Miss Marple visited the inn where the guest had stayed. The proprietor, anxious and meticulous, recounted the night's events in painstaking detail. Yet the more he spoke, the more Miss Marple noticed gaps and inconsistencies. Certain visitors had come and gone without explanation, while others lingered far longer than necessary. She asked simple questions, masking her intent behind polite curiosity, and noted the flicker of guilt that crossed faces whenever particular names were mentioned. Each response, she realized, added depth to the picture she was assembling, revealing the underlying currents of fear, resentment, and secrecy. As the day progressed, she turned her attention to the garden paths and hedgerows near the inn, areas overlooked by the authorities. Snow crunched beneath her shoes as she traced faint footprints, noting their direction and pattern. One set ended abruptly near a low hedge, suggesting someone had paused or concealed themselves. Another led toward a side entrance that had been left ajar. Miss Marple did not rush. She understood that the key to understanding human behavior was patience. She allowed the clues to speak in their own time, piecing together the puzzle from observation rather than speculation. In the late afternoon, villagers began to drift back to their homes, their conversations tinged with uncertainty and cautious conjecture. Miss Marple lingered in the square, speaking briefly with a few acquaintances while noting the absence of others. The selective presence or avoidance of certain individuals was as telling as any spoken statement. She observed who sought reassurance, who feigned nonchalance, and who lingered at the periphery, reluctant to engage. These behaviors, subtle yet persistent, revealed motivations, fears, and hidden alliances that no outward confession could provide. By evening, the village settled into an uneasy calm. Snowflakes drifted lazily from a pale sky, muting the sounds of footsteps and voices. Miss Marple returned to her home, her mind active with connections and conjectures. She reviewed each encounter, each subtle gesture, each half-spoken remark, aligning them against the facts she had gathered. The threads began to form a coherent pattern, revealing not only the likely movements of the missing guest, but also the anxieties, deceptions, and conflicts that had shaped the events. She knew that the next day would demand careful testing of her hypotheses, engaging the villagers in ways that would provoke reactions revealing hidden truths. As night descended, she settled by the fire, knitting in silence yet fully engaged in thought. The puzzle was complex, each piece delicate and intertwined with human frailty, yet she felt a quiet certainty that the labyrinth of secrecy would soon yield its secrets. Tomorrow, she reflected, she would observe, prompt, and test, allowing human behavior rather than force or intimidation to expose the hidden motives behind the disappearance.
St. Mary Mead appeared serene under the winter sky, yet beneath the placid surface,
currents of anxiety and suspicion ran deep, and Miss Marple, ever patient and discerning, was prepared to follow them wherever they led, knowing that clarity would emerge from the careful scrutiny of the ordinary, overlooked details that everyone else had ignored. The village of St. Mary Mead awoke to a crisp, pale morning, the sun barely warming the frost-laden streets. Miss Marple, already awake before dawn, moved quietly about her room, tidying small things with an air of deliberate calm. Outside, the village seemed unchanged, yet she knew that beneath this familiar surface, lives had shifted irrevocably. Events of the past days had unsettled people in ways visible only to those who watched carefully. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, eyes tracing the path the morning light took over the rooftops, each shadow and glint of ice telling its own story to an attentive observer. The air carried hints of tension as villagers emerged, cautiously polite, their footsteps deliberate on the snow-crusted paths. Conversations were muted, indirect, cautious. Everyone seemed to measure words, careful not to reveal too much or to provoke memories of recent upheavals. Miss Marple noted who avoided eye contact, who lingered at thresholds, who sought the company of familiar friends. She observed that fear, embarrassment, and guilt manifested in small gestures, a hand brushing nervously over a coat button, a head tilting away, a smile that did not reach the eyes. Each tiny detail, insignificant to most, was a clue to the intricate dance of human behavior she had been following. At midday, she visited the village hall, where the inquiry into the guest's disappearance had reached its conclusion. Local authorities, now confident, had made statements, believing the matter was solved. Yet Miss Marple's intuition remained unshaken. She spoke politely with each officer, nodding and murmuring agreement, while subtly observing their mannerisms. There was a slight tension in their responses, a hesitation that suggested not all facts were as they appeared. Her attention shifted to the villagers who gathered outside the hall, their expressions a mix of relief, apprehension, and something akin to disbelief. Some faces were masks hiding resentment, some concealing shame, others hinting at knowledge too carefully guarded to share openly. She then retraced the paths and rooms the missing guest had once traversed, mentally walking through each interaction, each encounter that day. The innkeeper had provided his account, seemingly complete, yet Miss Marple recalled the details that didn't quite fit, the timing of a passing visitor, the subtle avoidance of one servant when names were mentioned, the sudden alertness in the eyes of a man who claimed he had been elsewhere entirely. Each anomaly was a thread she would pull gently, testing the tension until the hidden truth revealed itself without forcing confession. Late afternoon brought her to the parish church, a place where truth often emerged quietly, not through confrontation but reflection. The villagers entered in pairs or alone, their chatter hushed, mindful of the sanctity and solemnity of the space. Miss Marple allowed her gaze to drift over them, considering character, consistency, and subtle incongruities. She remembered the fleeting gestures of the evening before, a hand resting too long on a pew, a frown at a casual remark, a whisper that carried more meaning than the words themselves. In these moments, she realized, human nature was far more revealing than any document, testimony, or outward display of innocence. As dusk approached, Miss Marple invited key villagers to her home under the guise of a casual tea. Her parlour, warm and orderly, encouraged conversation, while she subtly guided interactions, observing reactions with the patience of a cat tracking a bird. Questions were posed gently, opinions shared lightly, each response measured and catalogued. A hint of defensiveness here, a quickened breath there, an involuntary glance at another participant. These were the pieces she needed to see the puzzle whole. Slowly, imperceptibly, the threads she had been gathering began to intertwine, revealing patterns invisible to the hurried eye of those convinced by surface appearances. Finally, she turned to the woman whose demeanor had been carefully observed throughout, the subtle shifts in posture and voice confirming suspicions Miss Marple had nurtured since the first signs of deception. With quiet clarity she outlined her reasoning, each deduction flowing logically, linking gesture to motive, opportunity to action, and secrecy to exposure. The assembled villagers listened, rapt, as Miss Marple explained how the seemingly insignificant details, the overlooked glance, the abrupt withdrawal from conversation, the misremembered sequence of events, pointed unerringly to the truth. There was no need for raised voices or accusatory tones. The facts, once revealed through careful scrutiny of human nature, were undeniable. As realization dawned, expressions changed, some faces paled while others relaxed with relief. The guilty party, confronted not with anger but with reasoned understanding, acknowledged the impossibility of further concealment. Confession emerged naturally, almost with a sense of inevitability, for the truth, when carefully traced through observation, leaves no room for escape. Miss Marple listened attentively, nodding, her expression serene, almost maternal, as the story unfolded, confirming her long-held deductions and revealing the human impulses that had led to concealment, fear, and ultimately the crime. With the mystery resolved, the villagers gradually dispersed, some returning to the quiet routine of their homes, others lingering in contemplation. Miss Marple remained by the fire, knitting with deliberate calm, her mind still active with reflections. She thought of human nature, how secrecy, fear, and desire can entangle lives, and how the smallest gestures often speak louder than words. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muting the world, covering paths and footprints alike, as if granting the village a gentle pause, a chance to resume life with the knowledge that truth, however hidden, will always find its way to light. By evening the village had resumed a semblance of normalcy, yet there was a quiet reverence for what had transpired. Miss Marple sat in her armchair, sipping tea, contemplating the layers of human behavior that had led to both deception and revelation. In the stillness, she understood that while crime might disrupt a community, it also revealed the enduring complexity of human hearts. The warmth of the fire contrasted with the cold outside, mirroring the interplay of fear and honesty she had witnessed, and as the last light faded from the sky, she smiled softly, appreciating the subtle intricacies of a world where appearances are rarely what they seem, and truth always emerges, often through the quietest, most overlooked observations.